Hi, my name is Kevin Gomes, and welcome to my reflective analysis video for Foundations 2. In this video, I'd like to try and outline my vision of teaching as it developed during my time here at UOIT. To begin, I'd like to reflect on why I want to become a teacher, and I feel like this was demonstrated best in my personal statements of day one. When discussing why I want to become a teacher, I mentioned that I wanted to take an active role in molding our future generations, and I feel like this was really important. To me, education is a key aspect in ensuring that society moves forward. And rather than wait for things to develop and get better, I want to play an active role in actually making our world better. I feel that if done right, teachers have the power to motivate, inspire, and change lives. And I want to know that I've done my part in making this change. Now, there are a few things that I've carried on from last semester and I've continued to hone and refine. And the first is the idea of classroom management. When I began this program, having gone through the system myself, classroom management just meant being able to control my students, keeping them quiet, keeping them seated, and keeping them listening. However, I think my ideas have changed. I want my students to be open and willing to learn, and this means I need them to know that it's okay to make mistakes. I think the first step to good classroom management is creating a safe and comfortable and respectful classroom environment. The biggest change, though, I think is the idea of engagement and my realization that a well-engaged classroom often leads to well-behaved and receptive students. Rather than try to control my class, my focus has changed to what I can do to actually keep them engaged and keep them receptive. Another thing which I think was carried over and really reinforced was the idea of engaging students in a productive struggle and collaborative work. Now, this is partly because I'm aiming to be a math or physics teacher in the future, but it holds value regardless. In week one of this semester, I made a point to mention that lessons that went well for me went well because they had a productive struggle or relied on collaboration. And I feel like this idea was honed further in this semester when we learned that to have productive struggle, we need to ask planned, purposeful guiding questions in order to get students to think critically. I hope to put this into practice in my next placement. Moving on, I've also made some new additions to my philosophy of teaching, two of which stood out in particular. The first thing I'd like to discuss was my introduction to the history of First Nations people. Prior to the start of this program, I had absolutely no information on this topic beyond what we learned in elementary school. We began each day in the program with a land acknowledgement, which I found was an interesting ritual, but admittedly had no idea or understanding of it until week 4 of the program. Discovering the history of residential schools of Canada was shocking, not only because of how terrible people were treated, but because of the fact that despite being born and raised here, this was the first time I've heard of it. It didn't take long for me to realize that educators need to care about this topic. And as educators, we strive to make positive changes in society, but to make positive strides, we need to recognize the mistakes we made. We can't change the atrocities committed by our education system, but we can continue to make an effort to ensure that these things don't happen again. A big part of that is being aware of the land you're on and simply spreading the message. And I think that the Foundation Friday that we had on this was probably one of the most humbling experiences I've had so far. Thing I'd like to talk about is the concept of inclusivity. And even though this was the focus of week 9, I think my perceptions of this topic began to mold during week 3 when we discussed UDL and DI. These ideas were really foreign to me, and I was skeptical when they were first introduced. I knew they sounded good on paper, but I wasn't really sure how practical they can be in reality. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how important they could be for the subjects I was actually planning to teach. More than any other subject, students are often afraid and overwhelmed with the idea of math, mainly because of their difficulty or the problem solving. But this has a lot to do with the fact that these subjects are traditionally taught very linearly and are catered to students who learn in a particular way. I've realized that I have the potential to take these subjects and transform them into ones that are more accessible to everyone, including those who would traditionally avoid them. Admittedly, I'm not yet sure how to implement these changes, but it's something that I continue to think about and work on. Oddly enough, in week 9, I mentioned that inclusivity begins by creating a positive classroom culture, which promotes love, care, and respect. This is interesting because it seems to go hand in hand with my ideas of classroom management. I've begun to realize that good teaching practice naturally embodies much of what we learn in this program, and that these concepts end up overlapping, whether we realize it or not. I hope that I can put everything I've learned this semester into my next practicum. Thank you for listening.